The Mafia Boss's fiancée cut off the Curvy Maid's hair. She never expected the consequences. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us go back to our main character. They say a person can survive losing money, power, or even love, but there is one thing that leaves a scar no mirror can hide. It is the moment someone steals your dignity while everyone else watches. The crystal chandeliers hanging above the grand ballroom of the Blackwood estate sparkled like frozen stars, casting warm light across polished marble floors, and hundreds of elegantly dressed guests gathered for the engagement celebration of Damian Blackwood, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast. Expensive laughter floated through the air beside the sound of a live string quartet, while cameras flashed endlessly around the future bride. Every politician, business leader, and influential family wanted to witness the event. Hidden among the flawless decorations and priceless artwork was Abigail Brooks, a curvy young maid with gentle blue eyes and soft chestnut hair reaching well below her shoulders. Wearing a simple black maid uniform with neatly pressed sleeves, she quietly carried a silver tray filled with sparkling water between clusters of wealthy guests. She moved carefully, always smiling politely, always apologizing when someone barely brushed against her, as though making herself invisible had become second nature. Earlier that morning, one of the elderly cooks had admired her beautiful hair and asked why she never cut it despite the summer heat. Abigail had only smiled shyly before saying, "Some things are worth waiting for." She never explained anything more. Across the ballroom, Victoria Sinclair stood surrounded by photographers in a breathtaking white designer gown. Beautiful, confident, and admired by nearly everyone present, she carried herself like a woman who believed every room belonged to her. Yet beneath the perfect smile, irritation slowly grew every time Damian's staff complimented the flawless preparation instead of praising her appearance. When Victoria noticed one elderly guest thanking Abigail for kindly helping him find his seat, something inside her shifted. She watched the maid receive a grateful smile that she herself had been chasing all evening. It felt unbearably unfair. Abigail continued serving drinks without realizing. Victoria had begun walking toward her. The conversations around them softened as guests sensed something unusual. Victoria stopped directly in front of Abigail and looked her up and down with a pleasant smile that never reached her eyes. "You certainly seem comfortable attracting attention tonight," she said softly. Abigail blinked in confusion. "I am sorry if I have done something wrong, Miss Sinclair." Victoria reached out and gently lifted a strand of Abigail's long hair between perfectly manicured fingers. "Pretty hair," she whispered. "It is almost too pretty for a maid." Abigail instinctively stepped back, embarrassed by the unexpected attention. "Thank you." For one brief second, the ballroom became strangely quiet. Victoria turned toward a nearby decorative table where a pair of elegant gold ribbon scissors rested beside flower arrangements prepared for the evening ceremony. She picked them up with a casual smile that made the moment feel almost harmless. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances, but said nothing. Abigail stood frozen, believing the bride was joking. Instead, Victoria reached forward, gathered a thick lock of Abigail's carefully protected hair, and with one swift motion cut it away. The heavy strand slipped silently onto the polished marble floor. A wave of shocked silence spread across the ballroom. Abigail's hands slowly rose toward the uneven ends of her hair as tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. She did not scream. She did not argue. She simply looked down at the dark strands lying at her feet as though part of her heart had fallen beside them. At that exact moment, the massive entrance doors opened. Damian Blackwood stepped inside wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, his broad frame commanding immediate attention, intricate tattoos visible across his neck and hands beneath the ballroom lights. His sharp eyes scanned the silent crowd before stopping on Abigail. Then they moved to the cut hair scattered across the marble floor. Without speaking a single word, Damian slowly walked forward, bent down in front of everyone, and carefully picked up the severed lock of hair with both hands. Damian Blackwood remained, kneeling for several long seconds, the severed lock of chestnut hair resting carefully in his hands as though it were something far more valuable than anyone in the ballroom could understand. The silence surrounding him felt heavier than the music that had abruptly stopped. Hundreds of guests watched without daring to whisper. Victoria Sinclair forced an uneasy smile and let out a light laugh that echoed awkwardly through the room. "It was only a joke," she said, glancing around for agreement. "Her hair will grow back." Nobody answered. Damien slowly rose to his full height, his broad shoulders towering above the crowd. His gaze lingered on the lock of hair before lifting toward Abigail. She stood perfectly still, one trembling hand touching the uneven strands near her shoulder. Her blue eyes remained fixed on the marble floor, refusing to let anyone see the tears gathering there. Damien stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. Without saying a word, he removed a neatly folded black silk pocket square from his jacket and gently wrapped the cut hair inside it with surprising care. Every movement was slow, respectful, almost ceremonial. Abigail finally looked up, confused by his quiet kindness. He met her eyes for only a brief moment before speaking in a calm voice that carried across the entire ballroom. "Miss Brooks." She swallowed hard. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood. You are relieved of your duties for the rest of the evening." Several guests exchanged puzzled looks, believing she had just lost her job. Abigail lowered her head slightly. "I understand." She turned to leave, clutching the empty silver tray against her chest, determined to disappear before anyone noticed she was crying. Damien's next sentence stopped her before she reached the doorway. That was not a dismissal. She slowly turned back. Damien walked toward her and held out the silk handkerchief containing her hair. "Take this home." Abigail accepted it with shaking hands, unable to understand why he had protected something everyone else considered meaningless. Across the ballroom, Victoria folded her arms. "Damien, you cannot seriously be making this into a scandal." He looked at her, without raising his voice. "Go upstairs." Victoria frowned in disbelief. "Excuse me." "Go upstairs. We will speak later." The quiet authority in his voice unsettled even the most powerful guests in attendance. Victoria opened her mouth to argue but stopped when she realized every eye in the room had shifted toward her. She forced another smile, lifted her chin, and walked away with as much dignity as she could gather, though the confidence she had worn all evening had begun to crack. Abigail quietly left through the employee hallway, keeping one hand over the uneven ends of her hair. She managed to reach the small staff locker room before finally allowing the tears to fall. Sitting alone on the narrow wooden bench, she carefully unfolded the black silk cloth and stared at the long lock of hair resting inside. 6 years. 6 years without cutting it. She closed her eyes, remembering every impatient summer, every difficult morning brushing tangled strands before work, every time someone suggested she simply trim it. She had always smiled and answered, "Not yet." Now the choice had been stolen from her in a single careless moment. She reached into her locker and removed a soft gray knit beanie she usually wore during winter walks home. Pulling it low over her head, she looked into the mirror and forced herself to smile through red eyes. "It is only hair, Abby," she whispered. "You can survive this too." Meanwhile, inside his private study, Damien stood silently beside the window overlooking the estate. Vincent Russo, his most trusted advisor, entered after a gentle knock. "The guests are leaving early," Vincent said quietly. Damien did not respond. After several moments, he finally asked one question without turning around. "Find out why she spent 6 years growing her hair without ever cutting it." Vincent nodded once before leaving the room. Less than an hour later, he returned carrying a thin file and an expression Damien had rarely seen on his face. "Boss," Vincent said softly, placing the folder on the desk. "Tomorrow morning was supposed to be the day Miss Brooks donated every inch of that hair to children receiving cancer treatment." Damien Blackwood stared at the thin folder long after Vincent Russo quietly left the study. The words inside refused to fade. Abigail Brooks had spent 6 years patiently growing her hair for one reason alone. She had promised a children's cancer foundation that when it finally reached the required length, she would donate every inch to make wigs for young patients who had lost their own hair during treatment. Tomorrow morning had been circled on her calendar for nearly a year. Damien slowly opened the folder. Inside were copies of handwritten letters from the foundation thanking Abigail for 2 previous donations. One photograph showed her smiling beside 3 children wearing handmade wigs. Her hair had been much shorter then, but the joy in her eyes had been impossible to miss. Another letter explained that because of her unusually thick hair, one donation could help create more than one wig. Damien rested his hand against the edge of the desk. Victoria had not simply ruined someone's hairstyle. She had unknowingly destroyed years of quiet sacrifice. Before sunrise the next morning, Abigail arrived at the mansion wearing the soft gray knit beanie pulled low over her head. She hoped the kitchen staff would be too busy preparing breakfast to notice anything different. Unfortunately, hope rarely followed a schedule. The elderly cook looked up from a mixing bowl and smiled warmly. "Good morning, Abby. Why are you wearing a winter hat in September?" Abigail forced a cheerful grin. "Fashion emergency." The cook laughed. "Well, I have seen stranger trends." Abigail quietly joined the morning routine, slicing fresh fruit while humming under her breath. She worked carefully, pretending everything was normal, but every time she caught her reflection in a stainless steel appliance, her smile became a little harder to hold. A few minutes later, she reached for a carton of orange juice on the highest shelf. Standing on her tiptoes, she stretched as far as she could before the carton slipped from her fingers. It landed upright on the counter without spilling a single drop. Abigail blinked in surprise and placed one hand over her heart. "Well," she whispered to herself, "that is the most graceful thing I have done all week." One of the younger cooks overheard her and laughed. "You almost scared yourself more than the orange juice." Abigail laughed too, grateful that for one brief moment everyone treated her exactly the same as yesterday. Upstairs, Damien watched the security footage from the kitchen instead of attending his scheduled business meeting. He noticed how Abigail smiled for everyone else, but reached up to adjust the edge of her beanie whenever she believed nobody was watching. That tiny movement revealed more pain than tears ever could. He closed the monitor and walked downstairs. Abigail turned as he entered the kitchen, immediately lowering her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood." Damien looked at the gray beanie for a brief moment before speaking. "You had an appointment today." Abigail's fingers tightened around the dish towel she was folding. "Not anymore." She tried to smile again. "Someone else will donate. The children will still be helped." Damien knew she was trying to comfort everyone except herself. "Did you tell the foundation?" She gently shook her head. "I could not find the right words." There was no bitterness in her voice. No blame. Only disappointment quietly carried with dignity. Damien studied her for another silent moment before reaching into his jacket pocket and placing a small business card on the kitchen counter. It belonged to the director of one of the largest children's hospitals in the state. "Go there this afternoon," he said. Abigail looked confused. "Why?" "Because I asked them to wait before canceling anything." She stared at him, unable to understand. Damien held her gaze. "Some promises deserve another chance." Before Abigail could ask what he meant, Vincent hurried into the kitchen carrying his phone. His usually composed expression had vanished. He walked directly to Damien and lowered his voice. "Boss, Miss Sinclair has called every major media outlet in the city. She is telling reporters that the maid ruined the engagement party on purpose, and they are already driving toward the estate." Damien Blackwood did not waste a single second. He looked at Vincent, then quietly slid the business card back. Across the kitchen counter toward Abigail. "Go home," he said. "Pack whatever you need for tonight." Abigail immediately shook her head. "The reporters are here because of me. I cannot leave everyone else to deal with this." Damien held her gaze with calm certainty. "They are not here because of you. They are here because someone wants them to believe a lie." Before Abigail could answer, the sound of car doors closing echoed through the estate grounds. Camera flashes began sparkling through the front windows as reporters gathered outside the gates. Several employees nervously peeked through the curtains before quickly stepping back. Abigail instinctively lowered the edge of her gray beanie another inch, hoping no one would recognize her. Damien noticed the small gesture. Without hesitation, he removed his own black cashmere scarf and gently placed it in her hands. "Wear this instead." Abigail looked at the expensive scarf, then back at him. "I cannot." "You can." His voice remained quiet. "It belongs around someone worth protecting." The words caught her completely by surprise. She carefully wrapped the scarf around her shoulders, not because it was expensive, but because it somehow made her feel less alone. Outside, Victoria Sinclair stood confidently before a growing crowd of reporters, dressed perfectly despite the early hour. Tears glistened convincingly in her eyes as microphones surrounded her. I welcomed that maid into my home, she said with practiced sadness. Instead of respecting our family, she created unnecessary drama during the most important evening of our lives. Several reporters nodded while cameras continued recording every word. One journalist asked, "Are you saying she intentionally disrupted the engagement celebration?" Victoria lowered her eyes just enough to appear heartbroken. "I only know what everyone witnessed." She never directly lied. She simply allowed people to reach the conclusion she wanted. Inside the mansion, Vincent watched the live broadcast on his phone. "She is careful," he muttered. "Every sentence sounds innocent." Damien slipped on his jacket. Truth does not need better acting. He walked toward the front entrance. Before anyone could stop him, Abigail instinctively took one step after him. "Please do not make this worse because of me." Damien paused at the doorway without turning around. "Miss Brooks." "Yes. You have spent 6 years protecting children you have never met." He rested one hand on the polished brass door handle. "Allow me 5 minutes to protect you." Before she could answer, he stepped outside. Every camera immediately swung toward him. The questions came all at once. "Mr. Blackwood, did your maid ruin your engagement party? Is your relationship over? Will she be fired?" Damien stood silently until every voice faded. Then he spoke with measured clarity. "Yesterday evening, an employee of my household was publicly humiliated while doing her job." The reporters exchanged surprised looks. Damien continued. "She showed dignity. She showed restraint. She showed more grace than anyone had the right to expect." Victoria's confident smile slowly disappeared. Damien looked directly toward the cameras. "The woman you are trying to blame spent the last 6 years growing her hair for children receiving cancer treatment." A wave of stunned silence swept across the crowd. Several reporters immediately lowered their microphones. Damien's expression never changed. Anyone interested in reporting today's story should begin there. Without another word, he turned and walked back inside, leaving the cameras focused not on scandal, but on uncomfortable truth. Upstairs, Abigail stood frozen beside the staircase after hearing every word through the open doorway. Tears quietly rolled down her cheeks, but this time they came from something she had not expected to receive. Respect. Before anyone could speak, Vincent's phone vibrated again. He looked down at the message, and the color drained from his face. "Boss," he said carefully, "Victoria just left the estate with someone our security team has never seen before, and they are driving toward the Children's Cancer Foundation where Abigail was supposed to make her donation this morning." Abigail Brooks barely had time to process Vincent's warning before Damien Blackwood was already walking toward the waiting vehicles. Outside the mansion, she instinctively followed him across the marble foyer, still wearing the gray beanie beneath his black cashmere scarf. "Mr. Blackwood," she called softly. He stopped beside the front door and looked back. "You do not have to keep fixing problems that belong to me." Damien studied her for a quiet moment. "The problem does not belong to you." His answer was simple, yet it stayed with her long after he turned away. During the drive to the Children's Cancer Foundation, Abigail sat in the back seat beside Vincent while Damien remained silent across from them. The city rushed past the windows beneath a clear September sky. Abigail twisted the edge of the scarf between her fingers, trying to hide her nervousness. Finally, she smiled awkwardly. "I think this is the first time I have ever ridden in a car that costs more than every apartment I have ever lived in combined." Vincent laughed under his breath. Even Damien's eyes softened for the briefest moment. Abigail looked down at herself. "Please tell me I did not accidentally leave my kitchen apron on." Vincent glanced toward her and smiled. "No apron." Abigail sighed dramatically. "That is good. Yesterday, I almost answered the front door wearing oven mitts." The quiet humor eased the tension inside the vehicle more than anyone expected. When they arrived, volunteers hurried across the parking lot carrying boxes filled with donated supplies. The foundation looked peaceful, but the atmosphere outside the entrance felt strangely unsettled. Several unfamiliar luxury vehicles were parked near the front doors. Damien noticed them immediately. Inside the building, the executive director greeted them with visible relief. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Brooks, thank you for coming." Abigail looked around the bright lobby decorated with colorful drawings from young patients. "I am so sorry I missed my appointment." The director smiled kindly. "Do not apologize. We already know what happened." Abigail blinked in surprise. "You do? Your previous donations changed many lives here." One unfortunate event cannot erase 6 years of generosity. Abigail lowered her eyes, clearly trying not to cry again. At that moment, a little girl wearing a bright yellow headscarf walked over carrying a handmade thank you card covered with uneven hearts and glitter. She stopped in front of Abigail with a shy smile. "Mom said you are the lady who grows magic hair." Abigail laughed softly through her tears. "I do not think it is magic." The little girl shook her head confidently. "It is, because people smile when they wear it." Abigail carefully knelt to the child's eye level. "Then I promise I will grow it again." The girl wrapped her small arms around Abigail's shoulders without hesitation. Damien watched from several feet away. There was no performance in Abigail's kindness, no expectation of recognition. She simply treated every child as though they mattered. Before the moment could settle, raised voices echoed from a conference room farther down the hallway. Damien turned toward the sound. Through the partially opened door, he caught sight of Victoria speaking with a sharply dressed man he had never seen before. Papers were spread across the table between them, and the stranger quickly closed a folder the instant he noticed Damien approaching. Victoria's face briefly lost all color before she forced another composed smile. "Damien," she said, pretending surprise. "What a coincidence." Damien looked from Victoria to the unfamiliar man, then to the folder now resting beneath the stranger's hand. Something about the scene felt carefully arranged rather than accidental. The man extended his hand politely. "My name is Richard Hale. I advise several charitable organizations." Damien accepted neither the greeting nor the explanation. His attention shifted to the foundation's donation ledger lying partially exposed beside the closed folder. Across the top of the page, Abigail's name had already been crossed out with a thick black marker. Damien Blackwood's eyes remained fixed on the thick black line crossing Abigail Brooks's name. The room fell into an uneasy silence that even Victoria Sinclair could not disguise with another practiced smile. Richard Hale calmly closed the donation ledger and folded his hands across the conference table. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding," he said, politely. Damien did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer and looked directly at the foundation director. "Who crossed out her name?" The director hesitated before quietly replying. "The request came this morning from Mr. Hale." He explained that Miss Brooks no longer wished to participate in future donation programs after yesterday's incident. Abigail stared in disbelief. "I never said that." Richard offered a sympathetic expression that somehow felt rehearsed. "I was told you would be emotionally unable to continue." Abigail gently removed Damien's scarf from around her shoulders and held it neatly in both hands. Her voice remained calm despite the hurt in her eyes. "No one asked me." The little girl wearing the yellow headscarf quietly stepped closer and looked up at Abigail. "You promised your hair would grow again." Abigail smiled warmly before kneeling beside her once more. "And I always keep my promises." The child nodded with complete confidence, as though that single sentence settled every doubt in the world. Damien watched the exchange without speaking. He had negotiated with powerful men for years, yet nothing carried more weight than the simple honesty of that moment. He turned back toward Richard. "Restore her name." Richard remained composed. "Policies exist for a reason." Damien slightly tilted his head. "Truth exists for one as well." Victoria stepped forward before the conversation could continue. "Damien, this is becoming ridiculous. Everyone is acting as though I committed some unforgivable crime." "It was hair." Abigail quietly stood and looked toward Victoria. There was no anger in her expression, only sadness. "You did not take my hair," she said softly. "You took away the choice to give it." The words settled heavily across the room. Even Richard lowered his eyes for a brief moment. The foundation director slowly reached for the donation ledger, opened it again, and carefully erased the black mark before writing Abigail's name back into its proper place. "Your record never should have been changed without your permission," she said sincerely. Abigail smiled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." Damien noticed Richard watching every movement inside the room instead of reacting emotionally. It was the behavior of someone measuring outcomes rather than caring about people. As everyone prepared to leave, Richard's phone vibrated on the table. He silenced it quickly, but not before Damien noticed a photograph briefly appear across the screen. It showed the Blackwood estate taken from outside the security gates. Richard slipped the phone into his pocket without explanation. Damien said nothing, but the image remained in his mind. During the drive back to the mansion, Abigail quietly looked out the window while sunlight reflected across the passing streets. After several minutes, she turned toward Damien with an embarrassed smile. "I should probably apologize." He glanced at her. "For what?" She looked down at the folded scarf resting on her lap. "I cried on your very expensive scarf." Vincent laughed before he could stop himself. Abigail immediately covered her face with both hands. "I knew it. I officially owe the Mafia Boss dry cleaning." Even Damien could not hide the faint smile that appeared. "Keep the scarf." Abigail blinked. "Are you sure?" "Yes." She looked at the soft fabric before wrapping it around her shoulders once again. "Then I will take very good care of it." Damien looked out the window, but the corner of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. For the first time since the engagement party, the silence between them felt comfortable instead of painful. The peaceful moment lasted only until Vincent's secure phone rang. He answered, listened for several seconds, then slowly lowered the device. His expression grew serious. "Boss," he said quietly, "our security team just discovered that someone entered Miss Brooks's employee room while we were gone. Nothing valuable was stolen, but every photograph, every letter, and every document connected to her previous hair donations has disappeared." Abigail Brooks stood silently inside her small employee room while the afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor through the narrow window. Every drawer had been opened. Every shelf had been searched. The small scrapbook where she had carefully kept thank you letters from children over the past 6 years was gone. The photographs she treasured most had disappeared as well. Only ordinary clothes and inexpensive personal items remained untouched. She slowly sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers resting on the empty space where the scrapbook had always been. "They did not even take the jewelry box," she whispered. "They only wanted memories." Damien Blackwood quietly looked around the room without disturbing anything. Whoever had entered knew exactly what they were searching for. Vincent carefully photographed every corner before speaking. "Nothing else is missing. They ignored cash, electronics, and your passport." Abigail looked up in confusion. Why would anyone care about old letters from children? Damien did not answer because the same question had already begun forming inside his own mind. He slowly walked toward the bookshelf beside Abigail's bed. A single framed photograph still remained because it had fallen behind the shelf instead of standing on top of it. He picked it up carefully. The picture showed Abigail several years earlier surrounded by smiling children wearing colorful knit hats. One little boy proudly held a handmade paper medal around her neck. On the back of the frame someone had written in blue ink, "Thank you for making us feel beautiful again." Abigail smiled sadly. "I thought that one was gone too." Damien handed the photograph back to her. "Keep it somewhere safer." She accepted it with both hands before quietly laughing at herself. "I guess hiding things behind dusty furniture finally paid off." Vincent smiled faintly. "Sometimes accidents become good decisions." Abigail shrugged with an embarrassed grin. "That has described most of my life." Even Damien found the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. A few minutes later, the housekeeper brought hot tea for everyone. Abigail reached to help carry the tray and immediately bumped her elbow against the doorway. One teaspoon landed perfectly inside an empty flower vase standing across the room. She stared at it in complete disbelief. "I should probably stop surprising myself." Vincent chuckled. "That might be the most impressive accident I have ever seen." Abigail covered her face with one hand while laughing softly. The brief moment of warmth faded when Damien noticed a tiny scratch near the bedroom window latch. He examined it more closely before looking outside toward the staff parking area. "The window was open from the outside," he said quietly. Vincent walked over immediately. No signs of forced entry at the main doors. Damien nodded slowly. "This was planned." Abigail looked between them. "Do you think this has something to do with yesterday?" Damien turned toward her. "I think someone wants to erase every record proving who you really are." The sentence left the room completely silent. Abigail frowned. "But I am just a maid." Damien met her eyes. "No. You are the witness to a story someone wants rewritten." Later that evening, Vincent returned with another update after reviewing security footage from the estate. Most cameras had captured nothing unusual until one image caught his attention. A maintenance van had entered through the service gate for exactly 11 minutes during the time everyone was attending the foundation. The vehicle carried authentic identification, but the company listed on its side had no scheduled appointment with the estate. Vincent enlarged one blurry frame until a familiar face appeared behind the steering wheel. Damien recognized him instantly. It was Richard Hale. He had entered the Blackwood estate under a false identity while everyone else had been distracted. Vincent placed another document beside the still image. "Boss, there is one more thing. We traced Richard Hale's financial records." Damien looked up. Vincent took a slow breath before finishing the sentence. "For the past 8 months, he has received regular payments from an offshore account secretly controlled by Victoria Sinclair." Damien Blackwood did not react immediately after reading Vincent's report. He simply placed the document back onto the desk and rested both hands against the polished wood, staring at Victoria Sinclair's name for several silent seconds. 8 months. The payments had begun long before the engagement party. That single fact changed everything. Abigail Brooks sat quietly across the room, still, wearing the gray beanie and Damien's black cashmere scarf. She looked from Vincent to Damien, sensing that everyone except her understood what the report truly meant. "I do not understand," she admitted softly. "Why would Miss Sinclair pay that man to steal my letters?" Vincent looked toward Damien before answering. Damien gave a slight nod. "Because the letters prove your story," Vincent explained. "If nobody believes you ever planned to donate your hair, then yesterday becomes something completely different." Abigail lowered her eyes. "A careless misunderstanding." Vincent shook his head. "A public humiliation that could be rewritten as your own fault." Abigail fell silent. She had spent most of her life believing kindness eventually spoke for itself. She had never imagined someone would deliberately erase proof of it. Damien slowly walked toward the window overlooking the estate gardens. "Victoria is hiding something." Vincent folded his arms. "The financial transfers are real, but I still do not think she started this alone." Damien agreed. Victoria cared deeply about appearances, but she had never shown interest in stolen records or fabricated evidence. Someone else had to be directing the larger plan. Later that evening, Abigail insisted on helping prepare dinner for the household despite everything that had happened. The kitchen staff welcomed her with quiet smiles instead of uncomfortable questions. She reached for a mixing bowl, accidentally bumped a bag of flour with her elbow, and watched a soft white cloud drift into the air before settling across the countertop and part of her sweater. She stood perfectly still for a moment before looking down at herself. "Congratulations," she sighed dramatically. "I have officially become tonight's bread." The entire kitchen burst into laughter. Even the elderly cook wiped tears from his eyes. "Leave the baking jokes to me, Abby." Abigail smiled, brushing flour from her sleeves while trying unsuccessfully to keep a straight face. The laughter eased a weight Damien had noticed she had been carrying since the party. Standing unnoticed in the doorway, he realized she never used humor to draw attention. She used it to make other people feel comfortable. As dinner ended, Abigail carried a tray of tea toward Damien's study. She knocked gently before entering. Damien was reviewing several property files spread across his desk. She carefully placed the cup beside him. "You forgot to eat again," she said quietly. Damien looked at the untouched sandwich sitting on the tray. "You noticed?" Abigail smiled faintly. "The cooks notice everything." She turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "Thank you for believing me when I could not prove anything." Damien looked up from the documents. "You never needed to prove your character." Their eyes met for only a moment before Abigail looked away, suddenly feeling warmer than the tea she had just delivered. As she stepped into the hallway, she absent-mindedly walked straight into a tall decorative plant. The leaves shook dramatically while the flower pot somehow remained perfectly upright. Abigail closed her eyes in embarrassment. "One day," she whispered to herself, "I am going to defeat furniture." Damien heard every word through the half-open door. A quiet laugh escaped him before he could stop it. The sound surprised even himself. Meanwhile, several miles away, Victoria sat inside a private lounge across from Richard Hale. Unlike her confident appearance at the engagement party, tonight her hands trembled around a cup of untouched coffee. "You promised this would only embarrass the maid," she said. Richard calmly slid a thin envelope across the table. "Plans change." Victoria frowned. "What is that?" Richard looked directly into her eyes. "Everything we recovered from her room." Victoria slowly opened the envelope, expecting to find letters and photographs. Instead, the The first page contained an old legal document bearing the Blackwood family name. Her expression instantly changed from confusion to shock. She looked back at Richard. Why was this hidden with the maid's belongings? The question inside Victoria Sinclair's voice lingered long after Richard Hale quietly collected the envelope and slipped it back into his leather briefcase. That, he replied calmly, is exactly what I have been trying to discover. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her confidence noticeably shaken. You told me those papers would only protect my reputation. Richard folded his hands together. And they still might. But first I need to understand why Abigail Brooks unknowingly kept documents connected to the Blackwood family for years. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. She is a maid. She barely owns anything valuable. Richard offered a faint smile. Sometimes the most valuable things belong to people who never realize what they have. Across town, Damian Blackwood was reaching the same conclusion. He sat inside his private library while Vincent carefully spread copies of estate records across a large oak table. Every stolen item came from one box, Vincent explained. The thank you letters, the photographs, and one old envelope that Miss Brooks probably never opened. Damian looked up. Why not? Vincent shrugged slightly. It was addressed to her late grandmother. She told the housekeeper she kept it because it was the last thing she inherited, but she never wanted to disturb the seal. Damian's attention sharpened immediately. Where did her grandmother work? Vincent turned another page. As a seamstress. Damian waited. Vincent continued. For the Blackwood family nearly 30 years ago. The room fell completely still. Upstairs, unaware of the conversation unfolding below, Abigail carefully arranged fresh flowers in crystal vases throughout the mansion. She always replaced them every Monday morning, even though no one had ever asked her to. As she reached across a dining table to straighten one final bouquet, the sleeve of Damian's oversized cashmere scarf caught on the vase. She tried to save both at once, lost the battle almost immediately, and watched 3 white roses gently tumble onto the polished tabletop. Abigail sighed dramatically. I promise I was trying to make you prettier, not introduce you to gravity. She gathered the flowers with an embarrassed smile just as Damian quietly entered the room. He looked from the scattered roses to Abigail's apologetic expression. Everything all right? She held up one flower. The roses staged a peaceful protest. Damian looked at the crooked arrangement before carefully placing the last rose back into the vase himself. I think they surrendered. Abigail laughed softly. That was almost a joke. Almost. You are improving. Their eyes met for a brief moment before both looked away at exactly the same time. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt familiar. Later that afternoon, Vincent arrived carrying a small sealed package recovered from the estate archives. Boss, I found something your grandfather requested decades ago. Damian opened the faded file with careful hands. Inside rested employment records from the old Blackwood residence. One photograph immediately caught his attention. A young woman stood smiling beside his grandmother during a charity event. Vincent pointed toward the image. That is Abigail's grandmother. Damian studied the picture more closely before noticing the envelope resting in the woman's hands. It matched the exact description of the missing family letter. Suddenly, everything connected. Abigail had never hidden the document. It had simply been passed down through generations without anyone realizing its significance. Before Damian could speak, his secure phone rang. Vincent answered first, listened quietly, then slowly looked up. Boss, he said carefully. Our surveillance team has been following Richard Hale all afternoon. He is not meeting with Victoria anymore. Damian frowned. Then who? Vincent turned the phone screen toward him. A live photograph showed Richard entering a private office building downtown. Standing at the entrance to welcome him was one of Damian's oldest and most trusted financial advisors, the very man responsible for protecting every confidential record belonging to the Blackwood family. Damian Blackwood never rushed to conclusions, especially when trust was involved. The photograph of his longtime financial advisor standing beside Richard Hale remained on the screen long after Vincent lowered the phone. It was not proof of betrayal, but it was enough to force difficult questions. Set up a meeting, Damian said quietly. Do not let him know we are suspicious. Vincent nodded before leaving to make the arrangements. Upstairs, Abigail Brooks continued her afternoon routine as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She believed folding fresh towels and organizing guest rooms might help quiet the storm inside her mind. As she reached for a stack of clean sheets, one corner slipped from her hands and floated directly over her face. Abigail stood completely still beneath the enormous white sheet before laughing to herself. Well, this is one way to disappear from embarrassment. She pulled the fabric away just as Damien entered the hallway. He paused for a second, finding the unexpected sight strangely amusing. Abigail froze the instant she saw him. Please pretend this never happened. Damien's expression softened. I saw nothing. She narrowed her eyes playfully. You are a terrible liar. The corner of his mouth lifted. Perhaps. The brief exchange eased a tension neither of them had realized they were carrying. Later that afternoon, Damien and Vincent arrived at a quiet private office overlooking the city. Gregory Ellis, the Blackwood family's financial advisor for nearly 20 years, welcomed them with his usual calm professionalism. Silver hair framed a tired but kind face that had always earned Damien's respect. Gregory poured coffee for everyone before noticing Vincent's unusually serious expression. Something is wrong, he observed. Damien placed a photograph on the desk without speaking. Gregory looked down, immediately recognizing himself standing beside Richard Hale. Instead of denying the meeting, he slowly removed his glasses and sighed. I hoped this conversation would happen after I found more answers. Damien remained silent, giving the older man every opportunity to explain. Gregory folded his hands together. Richard approached me 8 months ago. He claimed he was researching several charitable trusts created by your grandfather. He believed one missing legal document could determine ownership of an old foundation worth millions of dollars. Damien's eyes remained steady. Did you believe him? Gregory shook his head. Not completely. That is why I never gave him access to family records. Vincent leaned forward. Then why meet him? Gregory looked genuinely exhausted. Because my grandson needs an experimental medical treatment that my insurance refused to cover. The room fell quiet. Gregory continued with visible regret. Richard offered financial help if I searched for one sealed letter connected to your family's earliest charitable projects. I accepted the meetings, but I never found the document. Damien studied the older man's face carefully. Years of loyalty stood against one desperate decision made for family. Did you tell Richard about Abigail Brooks? Gregory answered immediately. Never. Until yesterday, I had never even heard her name. Damien believed him. Gregory had made a mistake, but not out of greed. Before anyone could continue, Vincent's secure phone vibrated sharply. He answered, listened for several seconds, then slowly lowered the device. His face tightened. Boss, Richard Hale just left his office. Damien waited. Vincent looked directly at him. He is heading towards St. Margaret's Cemetery. Damien frowned. Why there? Vincent swallowed carefully before answering. Because Abigail Brooks's grandmother is buried there. And our team just confirmed someone opened her gravesite records this morning looking for the location of an unclaimed family safety deposit box registered under her name. Damien Blackwood arrived at St. Margaret Cemetery just before sunset, when long golden rays stretched across rows of weathered headstones and ancient oak trees whispered softly in the September breeze. The peaceful setting felt strangely untouched by the storm that had surrounded the past few days. Vincent parked a short distance away while Damien walked toward the small chapel where Abigail Brooks was already standing alone. She had not been told about the investigation. She had simply come to replace the faded flowers on her grandmother's grave, something she quietly did every month without fail. Wearing the familiar gray beanie and Damien's black cashmere scarf, she knelt carefully beside the headstone, brushing away a few fallen leaves before placing a bouquet of fresh white lilies into the stone vase. I am sorry I missed last month, she whispered with a gentle smile. Work became busy, but I brought your favorites today. Damien remained several yards away, choosing not to interrupt. He watched Abigail straighten the small American flag beside the grave before carefully polishing the marble with a folded handkerchief she carried in her pocket. Every movement reflected love instead of obligation. She noticed him only after standing again. Mr. Blackwood? She asked with quiet surprise. I did not know you were here. Damien walked closer, stopping respectfully beside the grave. Neither did I. Abigail looked down at the engraved name. My grandmother always believed flowers should never arrive late, even if people sometimes do. She smiled faintly. I guess I inherited that habit. Damien studied the headstone before asking, "Did she ever mention a safety deposit box?" Abigail frowned in confusion. "No, she never had much money." She thought for a moment before quietly adding, "She did tell me something strange once." Damien waited patiently. Abigail looked toward the old chapel across the cemetery. "When I was 12, she handed me an unopened envelope and said, 'Never throw this away, even if you never understand why.'" Her expression became thoughtful. "I always believed she was simply sentimental." Damien exchanged a brief glance with Vincent. The missing envelope suddenly carried even greater importance. Before anyone could continue, the elderly cemetery caretaker slowly approached, carrying a small ring of keys. "Miss Brooks?" he asked kindly. Abigail smiled. "Good afternoon, Mr. Reynolds." The old man nodded warmly. "I remembered something after those gentlemen came asking questions this morning." He reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed a tiny brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. "Your grandmother left this with me many years ago. She said if anyone ever came looking for old family papers before you did, I was never to hand it over." Abigail stared at the key in complete surprise. "She never told me." Mr. Reynolds smiled gently. "She said you would know when the right person was standing beside you." Abigail instinctively looked toward Damien before accepting the key with trembling fingers. Engraved across the tiny metal tag were the words Harbor National Bank Box 214. Vincent quietly inhaled. "That is the safety deposit box." Abigail looked between them, still unable to understand why her grandmother had hidden something so carefully. Damien spoke softly. "We will find out together." As the caretakers slowly walked away, a dark sedan rolled quietly past the cemetery entrance before disappearing around the corner. Vincent watched it until it vanished. Seconds later, his secure phone vibrated. He answered briefly, then looked toward Damien with growing concern. "Boss, our surveillance team just confirmed Richard Hale never came here." Damien frowned. "Then why did someone search the cemetery records?" Vincent slowly lowered the phone. "Because the request was submitted yesterday under your own name, using a perfect copy of your personal identification." Damien Blackwood did not speak during the drive from the cemetery. The tiny brass key rested in Abigail Brooks's hand, while Vincent quietly arranged the next steps through secure phone calls. By the time the sun disappeared beneath the skyline, the three of them had arrived at Harbor National Bank. The historic building had already closed to the public, but Damien's legal team had obtained emergency authorization to verify the ownership of Safety Deposit Box 214. Abigail stood silently beside the polished marble counter, twisting the blue ribbon attached to the key between her fingers. "I still cannot believe my grandmother never mentioned this," she whispered. Damien looked toward her. Perhaps she was waiting until the truth would be safer than the secret. The bank manager led them into the underground vault, where rows of heavy steel boxes stretched across the walls. Abigail carefully inserted the old brass key into the lock. A second key from the manager turned beside it, and the metal door slowly opened. Inside rested only 3 items. The first was a faded family photograph showing Abigail's grandmother standing beside Damien's grandfather during the opening ceremony of a children's charity many years earlier. The second was a sealed envelope addressed to the Blackwood family. The third was a leather notebook tied with a worn ribbon. Abigail picked up the notebook first. The handwriting belonged to her grandmother. The opening page read, "If you are reading this, kindness has finally outlived fear." She looked at Damien before carefully turning another page. Instead of hidden fortunes or shocking confessions, the notebook contained detailed records of charitable donations made by Damien's grandfather through anonymous foundations. Abigail's grandmother had quietly documented every family helped by those gifts so the donations would never be forgotten. Near the final pages rested one short entry written shortly before her death. "One promise remains unfinished. Return the sealed letter only when the Blackwood family remembers that generosity is worth more than reputation." Damien slowly accepted the envelope. The wax seal still carried his grandfather's family crest. With Abigail's permission, he carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter from his grandfather addressed to whoever would one day inherit both the family name and its responsibilities. The letter spoke not about wealth or power, but about protecting ordinary people whose dignity could never be measured by money. At the very end, one sentence stopped Damien completely. The Brooks family protected our honor when we were too proud to protect it ourselves. Never allow their kindness to be forgotten. Damien lowered the letter without speaking. The room remained silent except for the soft hum of the vault's ventilation system. Abigail looked at him with quiet uncertainty. I did not know any of this. Damien gently folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. Neither did I. Vincent stepped closer after reviewing the notebook. Boss, there is nothing here that would transfer property or fortune. Richard Hale risked everything for documents that hold historical value, not financial value. Damien nodded slowly. He believed there was hidden wealth. Abigail smiled faintly. Instead, he found proof that people try to do good. As they prepared to leave the vault, Vincent's phone vibrated again. This time the news came directly from federal investigators. Richard Hale had been taken into custody after attempting to sell forged Blackwood family documents to a private collector. During questioning, he admitted that Victoria Sinclair never knew about the notebook or the sealed letter. She believed he was only helping erase the embarrassment caused by the engagement party. She had been manipulated from the beginning by someone who understood her pride and used it against her. Abigail quietly lowered her eyes, realizing the woman who had humiliated her had also become someone else's pawn. Damien looked toward the elevator leading back to the lobby. Tomorrow, he said calmly, we end this the right way. As the heavy vault door slowly closed behind them, none of them noticed a framed newspaper hanging near the manager's office. The headline, published more than 30 years earlier, showed Damien's grandfather and Abigail's grandmother standing together beneath one simple sentence that would soon change everything. Anonymous donors saved Children's Cancer Center from closing. Several months later, the first cool breeze of early spring drifted through the gardens of the Blackwood estate, carrying the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass. The mansion no longer felt like the place where whispers, pride, and quiet cruelty had once filled every hallway. Laughter echoed from the courtyard where volunteers prepared tables for the grand reopening of the Blackwood Children's Hope Foundation, a charity rebuilt from the records hidden for decades inside Abigail Brooks's grandmother's notebook. Every donation listed there had been verified, every forgotten promise honored, and every family connected to those acts of kindness had been invited back to celebrate. Richard Hale had accepted responsibility for forging documents and manipulating others for personal gain. Investigators confirmed that Victoria Sinclair had been deceived into believing she was protecting her own reputation while unknowingly helping a much larger scheme. She was never accused of crimes connected to the forged records, but she chose to appear publicly before the foundation anyway, standing before cameras and many of the same guests who had attended the engagement celebration. Victoria took a slow breath before facing Abigail. There were no prepared speeches and no dramatic excuses. I cannot undo what I did, she said quietly. I believed appearances mattered more than another person's dignity, and I was wrong. I am truly sorry. The courtyard became completely silent. Every eye turned toward Abigail. She looked at Victoria for several long seconds before answering with gentle honesty. What happened will always hurt. But carrying anger forever would only give that moment more power than it deserves. I hope you become someone who never makes another person feel that small again. Victoria lowered her head, tears filling her eyes for reasons no camera could fully capture. Damien Blackwood remained beside Abigail without speaking. He never interrupted. He allowed her voice to carry the moment because it belonged to her. As the ceremony continued, children from the Cancer Foundation ran across the lawn wearing colorful handmade wigs and bright smiles. One little girl with a yellow headscarf hurried toward Abigail carrying a tiny mirror. Look, she said excitedly. Abigail laughed softly as she removed her gray beanie for the first time since the engagement party. Her chestnut hair had begun growing back, still shorter than before, but healthy and full of life. The little girl grinned. I told you it would come back. Abigail smiled. You were right. Damien watched the exchange before quietly stepping closer. From inside his jacket, he removed the same black silk handkerchief that still protected the lock of hair he had picked up from the ballroom floor months earlier. He had preserved it not because of what had been lost, but because it reminded him of the day he finally understood the difference between power and honor. He handed the folded cloth to Abigail. I think it belongs with you now. She carefully accepted it, her eyes shining with quiet emotion. You kept it all this time? Damien nodded. Some things deserve to be remembered. Abigail smiled through happy tears. Thank you. The guests slowly gathered near the garden pavilion where a new bronze plaque stood beneath an old oak tree. Damien unveiled it before the crowd. The inscription read, "In honor of every quiet act of kindness that changed a life without asking for recognition." Beneath those words appeared two family names side by side, Blackwood and Brooks. The applause that followed felt different from the applause heard during expensive parties. It carried gratitude instead of admiration. As the celebration drew to a close, Damien and Abigail walked slowly through the garden path lined with white flowers. He stopped beside the fountain where the afternoon sunlight reflected across the water. "There is one promise I would like to make," he said. Abigail looked at him with gentle curiosity. Damien reached into his pocket and revealed a simple ring, elegant without unnecessary display. "I cannot promise life will always be easy, but I can promise that no one will ever stand alone while I have the strength to stand beside them." "Abigail Brooks, would you spend your future with me?" She laughed softly through tears, accidentally dropping the bouquet she had been carrying before covering her face in happy disbelief. "I cannot believe I almost dropped the flowers during the most important moment of my life." Damien smiled warmly. "You always manage to make every important moment unforgettable." Abigail nodded as tears rolled down her cheeks. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." As friends, volunteers, and children celebrated around them, the little girl in the yellow headscarf hugged Abigail tightly and whispered, "Your hair really was magic." Abigail smiled and gently brushed a hand across the child's shoulder. "No," she answered. "Kindness was." High above the garden, the evening sun painted the sky with soft shades of gold as the foundation welcomed its newest families through open gates, proving that the greatest legacy was never wealth, reputation, or fear, but the courage to protect another person's dignity when it mattered most.